I look at this small cluster of human beings gathered at the funeral of a comrade who met her death in her mid-30s. How powerful the addiction, I think, that not all the physical disease and pain and psychological torment can shake loose its lethal hold on their souls. Nothing sways them from their habit. Not illness, not the sacrifice of love in a relationship, not the loss of all earthly goods, not the crushing of their dignity, not the fear of dying. The drive is that relentless. So the question is, what is the death grip of drug addiction? Why do people persist in this despite the obviously dire consequences? Now, there are many myths around drug addiction. One of them is that you have to hit rock bottom. Well, forget that one. If living in a downtown side of Vancouver in the streets with HIV is not hitting rock bottom, then one is. So it's not rock bottom that people need. The pervasive myths around the cause of drug addiction are the ones that activate and motivate social attitudes and legal policy, as well as medical treatment. One of them is that addiction is a matter of choice, that people choose these lifestyle habits out of moral weakness, ethical failure, stupidity. Well, as I'll be telling you, choice has nothing to do with it. Nobody ever wakes up in the morning and says, my decision, my desire, my motivation, my goal is to be a drug addict. That just doesn't happen to anybody. Number one. Number two, the other myth, which is the medical... Now, by the way, however, the idea of choice is the one that actually underlies the legal system. And the whole idea of the war on drugs is people are making bad choices, let's deter them from it. Or punish them if we can't deter them. So the jails in the United States are full of people because of the belief that people have chosen to be addicted. And the United States has got 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's jail population. So every fourth person in the jail in this world is a citizen of the land of the free. And much of that due to the drug laws. Now, the medical myth around drug addiction is that it's a genetic disease. So they're just caused by bad genes. And surely you can show it running in families, sure you can. But that doesn't make it genetic. And if you want to consider this idea of genetics, just look at the First Nations, or what in Canada we call the First Nations population, the Native Indian population in North America. The reality is this, that there were potentially addictive substances long before the coming of the Caucasians. There was peyote, there was tobacco, and in some areas there was even alcohol. But there was no history of addiction. If these people were genetically inclined, why weren't they addicted before the Caucasians came? Incidentally, there's another myth, which is that the drugs are addictive, which is nonsense, because if they were, they should have also been addicted. Incidentally, if drugs were addictive, we couldn't give morphine to anybody in hospital. But we can give large quantities of morphine to large numbers of people, they never become addicts. If the drugs are addictive, they all should be. So that the drugs themselves don't cause the addiction either. But what you'll notice about the genetics myth and the idea of choice is whatever their truth or lack of it, they both take society off the hook. If something is an individual choice or genetically determined, we don't have to look at social conditions. We don't have to look at people's actual lives. We don't have to ask what actually happened to them in this life. And also that means we don't have to look at social policy. We don't have to look at how society is structured, how it functions, and what it does to people. Now, this is really a much longer talk, so I can only give you the gist of it. But what I'm proposing is pretty much what I proposed this morning, which is that to understand human beings, we have to take what's called a biopsychosocial perspective. And biopsychosocial means that the very biology of human beings is shaped by the psychological and social environment in which they lived. And I hope I went some ways towards at least demonstrating that point to you. Now that's what we have to apply to addictions as well. So let's look at addictions from that perspective. Well, let's look at them more narrowly first from the medical point of view. From a medical point of view, it's very clear what addictions are. In every case, they're self-medications. We talk about concurrent disorders these days. Concurrent disorders, other mental health conditions that may accompany the addiction. Well, the fact is, you can take for granted that there's a concomitant disorder there every time. Because addictions are self-medications. Now, what do people self-medicate? Well, with the American Army in Vietnam, in Iraq, there was a study a couple of years ago that showed that people, soldiers wounded in battle or soldiers who underwent a potentially traumatic incident, if they're given a little bit of morphine shortly after, they're less likely to develop PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Morphine and heroin, or the opiates in general, are self-treatment for PTSD. So people self-medicate PTSD, as you know, because so many of the veterans coming back are now heroin addicts. What else do people self-medicate? And we can consider in a moment why so many people have PTSD, by the way. What else do people self-medicate? Well, I'll be giving a talk on attention deficit disorder this afternoon, or sometime today, I'm not sure what time. And I've been diagnosed with that myself. Now, how do you treat ADHD? With stimulants. Ritalin, dexedrine, Adderall, so on. What do stimulants do? They elevate the level of a chemical in the brain called dopamine. And I'll tell you about dopamine in a minute, but it's an essential brain chemical. What else elevates dopamine? Crystal meth, cocaine, tobacco, nicotine, and caffeine. People who are stimulant addicts are very often self-medicating ADHD. And a significant percentage of stimulant addicts, not to mention alcohol, 40% of male alcoholics. I spoke at an AA convention in San Francisco a few weeks ago. Half the room was buzzing like this. They all have ADHD. I could recognize them because I know that energetic style from within. People self-medicate ADHD with caffeine and certainly with cocaine and crystal meth. In fact, I'll even tell you that when I do cocaine, I'm not like others. I get calmer. They're pretty much handing you the diagnosis on a platter. What else do people self-medicate? People self-medicate anxiety with the opiates and the tranquilizers. People self-medicate depression. Cocaine not only elevates dopamine levels in the brain, it also happens to elevate serotonin levels in the brain, which, as you know, is implicated in depressive states. So people self-medicate depression, social anxiety, social phobia, and so on. So the fact is that on one level, addictions are all self-medications. That's the first point. But going deeper, we have to ask, well, why do these drugs work in the human brain and what do they do there? So this is a bit of brain physiology here. So the opiates, which derive from the Asian poppy and opium and heroin, morphine, codeine, and the various humanly created opiates like Dilaudid and OxyContin and so on. Well, human beings have used these substances for thousands of years in medicine. And why, of course? Anyone? Well, before what? Pain relief. So they're the most powerful pain relievers that we have. But here's the deal. They don't only relieve physical pain, they also relieve emotional pain. As a matter of fact, if you look at the brain structures that experience emotional pain, where psychological pain is interpreted and experienced on the emotional level is the same place is where it's experienced and interpreted physical pain as well. So that's why the language speaks about pain. Like when you said that, it really hurt me, or that was a very painful experience. So physical and emotional pain are modulated in the same part of the brain. And people who are undergoing an experience of emotional rejection while having a brain scan, the same part of the brain will light up as if you stuck them with a knife. So people are self-medicating emotional pain. And so the real question in addiction, and not just the opiates, by the way, because if you look at alcohol, that's also a painkiller. So is cannabis. Cocaine is a local anesthetic. So the first question in addiction always is not why the addiction, but why the pain. Now, in order to ask why the pain, you can't look at genetics. You have to look at people's lives. That's the first point. The second point about the opiates is why do they even work? Why do substances derived from a poppy plant grown in Asia work in the human brain? Because we have receptors for them. So we have opiate receptors. Why do we have opiate receptors? Well, long before they had been found, people surmised that there must be an internal opiate system in the body, otherwise we wouldn't have receptors for them. And we do.